In the 14th century, in the south of England, in Norwich, there's a church called St. Julian's. And attached to the side of this church is this little room. And in that room lived a woman, probably a widow, of about 30 years of age. And she had felt that she was called to the life of living in isolation, of setting herself apart from the rest of society and living in this little cell. There was a window that opened up into the church so that she could participate in worship services. People would speak to her through the window, and she was able to pray for them and minister to them and receive ministry from them. We don't know what her name was, but we call her Julian of Norwich, named after this church. You have to remember that during the 14th century, the bubonic plague was making its way through Europe, and it made its way through this area of Norwich multiple times while Julian was in her cell. So she's there living in isolation, surrounded by pestilence and disease, and she prays to God. And her prayer is not perhaps what you might expect. She prays that she would be struck by illness. And indeed, she finds herself one day hit with an intense fever. She says she feels as though she is dead from the waist down. She's unable to stand. And over the days, the illness progresses and spreads up her body so that she can no longer sit up under her own strength. Her eyes roll back in her head, and she says this is like the soul attempting to look to heaven, looking towards its path of escape from the turmoil of embodied life here. But someone came to visit her, bringing a crucifix, and held the crucifix in front of her and said, "Look to your Saviour." And she didn't want to. She wanted to keep her eyes rolling back, looking to the heavens, but she forced herself to bring her eyes back down to earth, to look at what was in front of her and to see this crucifix. And what she saw there, she says, was the wondrous suffering of Christ. And she received what she called these revelations, these showings of the reality of our life with God and God's life with us, the commonality that we have with the sufferings of Christ. And she experiences a healing here. She says that the illness left her, but she's undergone a radical change. See, when she was asking to be struck down, it's as though she's asking to be in control of her own spiritual destiny, be in control of her own life. But when the illness afflicts her, when she's confronted with the suffering of Christ, what she realizes is that she's unable to be in control of her life. Instead, her life is radically dependent upon God. And so in this period of isolation, of spreading disease, we can learn something, I think, from the lessons of Julian, that we are not in control of our own lives. We are, like her, vulnerable. Those we love are vulnerable. And everything that we have, everything that we can be, everything that we are, is dependent upon God for what it is. The fascinating thing about Julian is that she experiences these illnesses. She's very conscious of the problem and pain of affliction. And yet her final word is that all will be well. All manner of things will be well. God might strike you down, she would say, and yet all will be well. God might spare you, and yet all will be well. So in this uncertain, vulnerable period, perhaps we have something to learn from her. That whether we are spared, whether we are afflicted, we are still vulnerable and dependent upon God for all that we have. And we might say with her that all will be well.